Characters have fears. They're afraid of things. They're not going to tell you what they're afraid of. Neither is my next door neighbour, who talks to me every day and smiles and is very easygoing. But she's afraid of something. She's nervous about something. She doesn't often wake in the middle of the night, but when she does, it's the same thing that's always on her mind. I could live beside her for the rest of my life, for the rest of her life, and never know. The police could come and arrest her. They could take her into the interviewing suite. They could play good cop, bad cop on her. She could break down and confess the most minute crimes to the bad cop, or more likely to the good cop. But she might never enunciate, she might never speak this fear. Nobody knows it. Her own sons don't know it. But the writer has to know it. Because if the writer knows it, and the process of writing the story may be to learn what it is, I suspect what it is. I do suspect what it is. But I don't know until I write the story. I don't know until I put her in motion and allow her to encounter some element of this. And that's why I write a story. I might be cruel. I might come across as cruel sometimes, and a part of me is cruel. Because I subject her to this in my imagination when I'm washing the dishes. I create her and then I torture her. It's not a very nice thing to do. I don't generally kill people, comma, in my stories. But the same curiosity, the same morbid curiosity maybe, is there somewhere. The same kind of manipulation. And if the reason I'm attracted to stories, and I don't think I'm that different to everybody around me, is the same reason that people pick up stories in the first place or listen to stories, and the truth is, as I say, most of us hear more stories and see more stories than read them. If we're that interested in things that are obviously and evidently made up, it must be that's not the facts. It's that we're drawn to the characters because somewhere, at some level in our heads and in our hearts, we know that even the story of the boatload of people washed up on the desert island, or the person who survives somehow a calamity in space and ends up having his capsule crash down onto an unknown planet of troglodytes, that somehow the story that's going to be told there is going to be my story, is going to be Pat Boran's story. That something of what happens will be a reflection and an exploration of a part of myself. Now, you could say, why don't I just write about myself all the time? And it's a very good question. Because I'm ultimately dull. And so are we all. That stories make dull things interesting. And they make interesting things more interesting. They are fiction. They're made things from the Latin to make things. They're exaggerations. So a little bit like our fascination at the moment as a culture with cameras and the way cameras can zoom in and zoom out. Writers can do that. So we find a person, we find a situation that that person will explore and reveal something of themselves in, and we zoom in on that because we want to know more about that. We're like the Greek gods who are constantly nudging and pushing and battering people to see what it was like to be human. We're like the angels in Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire who can't feel passion themselves, so they get others into trouble, in a sense, to see what it's like, to watch and to learn from it. if a character is afraid of something, if Clarice has a bad experience as a child, you can be sure that at some stage in that story, in her encounter with Hannibal Lecter, you can be sure at some stage in that story that that experience as a child is going to colour her reaction to an event in the present tense. Obviously, otherwise the event in her past wouldn't be mentioned in the story. There would be no necessity for the flashback. But the two are the parts of the same event. The event is just playing out over a very long period. And in stories, there are always sub-stories. There are always subplots, if you like. Some of them happen in a moment. John and Mary meet, they love each other, and they get married. It took 11 months in this case. That's the short story in this story. The long story is John is a recovering alcoholic. Mary doesn't know that. And 11 more months into the story, she's going to start to find the evidence that he's lapsed. So you can have all different kinds of time frames. You need to be able to zoom in, and you need to be able to zoom out. But if someone is afraid of something, you can be sure that at some stage, even the laziest reader can be sure that at some stage in the story, if Mary doesn't like dark places, she's going to have to enter a cave, an underground car park at night, very likely alone, and the batteries in her flashlight will fail just at the wrong moment, etc., etc., etc. We're talking in cliches because it's simple to conjure these things up. But the truth is, things only become cliches because their parts work and because somebody has recognized them.